Whereon.
We're live to tape with Whereon. My name is Jason. It is October 4th, 2018, and this is episode 3, where we discuss the beginning of a story. I had a conversation with Amy Zeranek, who is currently earning her master's in creative writing from Ashland University, my alma mater, and she recommended that we talk about our favorite books in high school. She and I were having a conversation about it. I'm like, well, that sounded like a really good idea. We should go ahead and post that on social media and see what people think. Well, no one thought much. It was only out there for about 4 hours, and yeah. There were no comments, a couple of messages, and they weren't all that serious. So we're not going to go into a big discussion at the start of this episode like I really wanted to. I will say that my favorite book is, from high school at least, is The Great Gatsby. Good on so many levels. Daisy's kind of a jerk, and Jay Gatsby should have just kind of moved on. But I get it. Let's talk about love. And also, Jay Gatsby has the same initials as me, so that's kind of awesome. Amy's favorite book is Grapes of Wrath, which I have to admit that I've never read. I probably read it at some point or was supposed to read it at some point in high school, and I just got the Spark Notes for it. Was able to pass the test and move on. So I'm hoping to have her as a guest on the show coming up soon, and at which point I'm certain we'll get into talking about Grapes of Wrath, and she will make fun of me for not reading it. But until then, we will go ahead and get on with this episode, which I've been looking forward to since the start. This episode is the sort of episode that is hopefully going to be what this podcast become, and that is just talking about the craft of writing, step by step, while I go ahead and rewrite my thesis. For somebody who hasn't listened to episode number 1, when I finished writing my thesis, I had about 85,000 words, and I gutted it down to around 35,000. Lots of holes. I moved around the characters, consolidated some characters, and then basically turn my manuscript into 3 acts with a bunch of notes, a bunch of loose leaves, and I keep saying and. Does anyone else notice that? My sister-in-law is a communications professor, which means if she heard how many times in one podcast I say the word and, she would kill me. So I will begin to work on that as we move forward, because as anyone who likes public speaking knows, we all have tics. Some people stutter, some people say and, some people say My tic, because I normally, whenever I talk, it's normally in front of a big group of people and I don't have a podium. So I gulp, and evidently now that I'm recording podcasts, I say and. I apologize. I will begin working on it. Whenever you hear a big pause, just know that I'm fighting to not say and. This is a journey. I almost said and again. Dude. So this, and of course, instead of saying and, I just say so. Awesome. Love it. I am falling apart. But I'm not going to edit this part out, because this is part of the fun of it. This is part of the reason why I do this podcast, is to show the rough, sort of raw, creative process. It's not anything that's smooth. Maybe for some people it is, but for me, it's definitely not. So thank you. If anybody cares to, when you listen to a podcast in the future, go ahead and count how many times I say and leave it in the comments. That would be hysterical. But with me trying to not be too self-conscious about not saying and, the start of the story is extremely important. Some people believe the middle is the most important. Some people believe the ending is the most important. I believe the ending is the most important. However, you can't get to the end unless you actually hook the reader at the beginning. There are a couple philosophies about the best way to do this. In literary circles, at least what we were taught during the master's program, is that you have one page. If you have to do something to hook the reader on the first page, and that includes the first page of the prologue. Some people think, oh, well, people don't read the prologue. Yes, literary agents read prologues. Professional readers and professional writers, they read prologues. Why? Because it really does enhance the story when you read the darn prologue. So, first page of the prologue needs to hook you. If you're hooked on the first page, usually they'll read, if you're like a professional reader, if you're submitting to an agency or a publisher or something, the reader will read the first 3 to 5 pages if they like the first page. Then you need to hook them in the next 3 to 5 pages, depending on who you talk to, 3 to 5 pages in order to get them to read the first 10 pages. Usually, if they read the first 10 pages, they'll finish towards the end of the first chapter if the chapter's longer. And if they finish the first chapter and they like it still, they will usually finish the book, even if it ends up, having a bad ending or something like that. So that being said, my thesis novel has some issues with the start of the book. So I'm going to try not to give too much away about the novel, just because when it's finally said and done, I still want people to read it. But basically, the protagonist she initially started out as a 23-year-old female because I wanted her to be a female for certain literary reasons. But also I wanted her to be young because I wanted her to be old enough to have her feet under her and know what she wants to do. But I wanted her to be young enough that she didn't have a whole bunch of life experience. As soon as you deal with both of your parents dying, a 23-year-old woman will deal with that very differently than a 33-year-old woman. And whether that they're women really doesn't matter. A 23-year-old man will deal with it differently than a 33-year-old man. And a 23-year-old character can have different vices, different pitfalls, and things like that if a 33-year-old character has, no one would really believe. That being said, I'm going to get off the topic of my protagonist here in a minute, but that being said, I am going to be changing, as of right now, I'm going to be changing the age of my protagonist from 23 to probably 28 or 30, just because a lot of the issues with like depression and abuse and stuff that the character was dealing with ended up sort of becoming like a lightning rod in the book, and I want it to be more, I'm getting rid of some of the protagonist issues. How about that? So part of it is, as soon as you go to make a big change like that, well, I really wanted her, for the years I wanted her to be this certain age, and now in order to, make everything tighter, if you will, I'm going to make her just a little bit older so she's not dealing quite so much with these problems of youth, if you will, which I'm probably going to get some blowback for that, but that's okay. So the actual inciting incident, now that we're almost 8 minutes into the podcast, the actual, every novel, every story has to have an inciting incident. And the basic definition of that is it's what breaks the stability. It's what gets the character off of the couch, if you will, and into action. For example, most everyone's seen Star Wars. In the original Star Wars, I know I'm going to get yelled at for this too, that's fine, just shoot me an email. In the original Star Wars, where, Darth Vader, there's a big stormtrooper battle, Darth Vader walks onto a ship and yells at Princess Leia, and the two droids hop in the escape pod and they go to some desert planet. Got it. The inciting incident for that happened before the start of the movie. The inciting incident for that was the plans the rebels stole, which ended up being a whole nother movie later, but that's not where we're going. But we never saw the inciting incident. Two characters came together and they started discussing the reason why Princess Leia was running and why Darth Vader was after her and why the droids ran. All of these reasons were because of something that started before the movie. That is what I had initially wanted to do with my book. The inciting incident where the female protagonist, both of her parents are killed and she barely escapes with her life. And we meet the two characters at the beginning, the firefighter and his wife, who talk about it. And there's another and again. And then so I fill it with dude, I need to go back to public speaking school. Okay. The issue with that is that we don't know who the character was before. All we do is we see her in the aftermath of all this. Now, it's pretty cool because we get to see how beat up she was, and maybe we can give some flashbacks and things like that. The bummer is that we don't actually know who she was. I can tell the story in flashbacks, but that gets into metafiction, which is not only a talk for another day, but not something I'm wanting to do with the book. I want to keep this book grounded in the same sort of time and place. But now we don't know her parents. We don't know what her life was like. I was able to solve some of that by having it be a journal, But keep in mind, I'm trying to come up with these different literary ways to solve the problem of backstory because I'm having the inciting incident happen before the book starts. All we know about in the Star Wars example is that the rebel spies stole the plans. We figure out later why. Well, because they're bad guys and they're trying to steal the plans to, whatever the plans are bad. The plans are good. The bad guys have the plans. The good guys want the plans. So cool, got it. But as soon as we're trying to come up with all of, Luke and Leia being siblings, and Vader being Luke's father, and the mother, and dying during childbirth, and all of this, then we need 2 more episodes later to fill in the backstory, and we end up having 3, 4, 5, 6, however many different prequels there have been to just flush out what the story is. We don't have that much time in a novel. We need to establish pretty quickly who the protagonist is and where she's coming from, things like this. So I came up with the idea of having having her tell her story in a journal, which, okay, cool. It's not a bad idea. But then I need to write from a first-person female's perspective, which is going to be a series of episodes all in itself. And there are quite a few women from my creative writing program at Ashland University who I know would love to get on here and give their opinion of my ability to do that, because one of the things I'm really working on rewriting. My thesis advisor sentenced me to read 20 books written by female authors before I even attempt to write in a first-person female voice again, just because I got it that wrong, which is completely okay. Anyway, see, I'm soaked. I didn't say and. There we go. So what do? I was really married to the idea of having the inciting incident be before the book started. However, I've gotten a lot of feedback during my thesis semester, and it ranged from everyone saying, yes, it's really great that we don't see the inciting incident, but you need to have the very, very first 10 pages really, really hit harder than they do, which is understandable. Or we have the other school of thought that is, no, you actually have to see the inciting incident. It's the story written the way it was when I defended my thesis just doesn't work unless we actually do see the inciting incident. Because, think about Star Wars. How different would episode, was it 4, A New Hope be if instead of us meeting Darth Vader, as soon as the door blows up and he goes and they kick the bodies aside and he walks through, looks out and breathes. What if that wasn't the start of the movie? What if the start of the movie was, barring the prequel that came later, what if the start of the movie was some dude sneaking something into a pocket and then beaming it aboard by rebel spies? Like, it would completely change the whole feel. It would change the entire experience. And especially because my inciting incident is so life-altering for her. Her parents are killed. Some unknown person kills them, burns the house down, at least as it is right now. And the whole story is the aftermath of her fighting a devil that she doesn't know. My brother says, the devil you know is the devil you know is scary. The devil you don't know is scarier than the devil you do know. So I was kind of using that as a theme here, but a lot of the feedback I've gotten are people saying, no, just instead of having the devil be hidden, show us how, powerful the devil is. So my decision was to still not show the inciting incident. However, it wasn't for purely literary reasons. Right now, the first people who were when I defended my thesis, the first people who talk were a firefighter who actually saves the protagonist from the house fire. And it's he and his wife, talking about, they're talking code about their own marriage problems while he's, still, being haunted by the events he saw, because firefighters, I have a friend who's a firefighter down in Stocksdale, and, they very rarely get any closure. So I was kind of playing that up, and I kind of wanted the reader to feel the trauma of it without, like the mental trauma of it without actually knowing 100% what went on and actually living it. The other reason, as I was saying before I got completely sidetracked, the other reason, the non-literary reason why I don't want to show the inciting incident is because I do not know how to write a firefighter. I've never been in a fire. I've always run away from fire if it was in a building and not run toward it. So I don't feel that I can be on board in a third person or, God forbid, even a first person point of view from a firefighter who's actually fighting the fire. Because as soon as anything like that, I would write something like that, a firefighter would read it and say, okay, yeah, this is so stupid. So it is possible before this book is published that I'm able to get a ride along and do some interviews with some firefighters, and possibly change this entire beginning of the book. As of right now, I don't think I'm going to do that just because I want to be a fiction writer, not a creative nonfiction. And what I don't know, I'd rather make up and rather than research. So if I can get a ride along, that'd be cool. And if I feel comfortable like portraying it accurately to firemen, then got it. What I do know about is, thoughts after traumatic events. I did have a conversation with my buddy Ethan down in Stocksdale, Arizona, and he talked me through like the mindset of a firefighter and stuff like that. Stuff that is kind of universal when it comes to trauma and witnessing bad things and things like that. But I don't need to, that each person handles differently, but I don't need to actually write about the procedure of being a fireman. So that's one reason why I'm not going to show the inciting incident, at least as of right now, why I'm not going to show the inciting incident. The bummer is that as soon as I'm not showing the inciting incident, now the woman, the protagonist, starts at her ultimate low. Now, when first time we meet her, we don't really know. We can get a glimpse of who she was by her friends and by if we read old journal entries and things like that. But we're starting off with her already kicked to the ground and at the lowest she's ever going to be in her life. And then we just watch her grow. That's cool, but we're not really rooting for her. Sure, we can have people say, oh, do you remember when, she was this way? That works, but then that's dialogue. That's, telling someone, that's not showing. Remember, in writing, you want to show more than you tell. And don't be like me, which is some feedback I had, that I tend to show and tell. Because of the way I do journal entries in the book, people are like, oh my gosh, you show it's what's going on, then you have her retell the story from her perspective. Got it, but it gets redundant. And again, another story for another time. Why am I saying all this? Because I had the idea to allow us to get to know the protagonist more and actually watch her downfall. I would have the prologue be journal entries from before the inciting incident, from before her family was in the fire. And we won't know really what's going on with the prologue, but the prologue would be like this pile of journal entry breadcrumbs that we look through and we're like, okay, got it. We don't see what's going on, but we know these little bits of information. We know that she is very active in school. We know she's an adjunct professor. We know that these two people are her friends. We know she's, a kickboxer, like a semi-pro kickboxer and, runs a kickboxing class at school. We know all these things. We know that her parents are inviting her for some reason, and she's curious why her dad's inviting her home, on a weekend she doesn't normally go. Things like this, little things that don't really make much sense until, boom, chapter 1, we jump from when she shows up at home, and now suddenly, boom, we jump to, let me rephrase this whole thing. We don't jump to when she shows up at home. We got the big pile of breadcrumbs that show us through the journal entries, because I keep using the journal entries throughout the rest of the book. We see who she is in little glimpses and images, and we don't get a full picture, but we know certain things about her, and those certain things about her become important throughout the rest of the book. So, for example, alcohol abuse is something that I address in the book, and to the point that one of my instructors from the master's program, Naomi Williams, an amazing writer, She said that my characters didn't have a drinking problem. My manuscript had a drinking problem, which was kind of cool. So I'm gonna change that around a little bit. But what I'm gonna do is have her not have a drinking problem at the beginning to show that she doesn't like to drink, and then later, as soon as in chapter 2 we see that she has a substance problem now, it's a bigger jolt. We're like, oh, okay, instead of one line of dialogue saying, yep, she wasn't a drinker and now she's 2 bottles of tequila in, we can actually see the her writing in her journal about how she doesn't drink and she has a couple beers maybe, but she really doesn't like liquor, and what she thinks about it, and all this, almost bordering on self-righteous talk. And then as soon as we see her, after she's released from the hospital, the first thing she does is go hit a bottle of tequila. Now suddenly that has a whole lot more power, where the way I had it written for my thesis defense, suddenly she's drinking tequila. It's like, oh, she didn't like that before. Well, okay. And it didn't really have much of an impact. So that is the way I'm both putting the appropriate backstory into the start of my story, with keeping the journal entries and not turning it into metafiction. However, I'm still not showing the inciting incident. I'm having a big gap there. And the way I can justify doing that is by having the entire prologue just be her journal entries. Because the book itself is told from third-person point of view from various people, and the only time we are ever inside her head is through journal entries. So I can use that, what's the right word? I can use that form of telling the story. I know there's some good literary word and it's just not coming to my brain. I can use that way of telling the story since it makes sense for the book, and basically have my cake and eat it too. I can have us learn something about her, but have it not break up the cadence of the book. I know I'm going to get some blowback because I still don't show the inciting incident, even though I have an epilogue, and then I basically skip it to get to chapter 1. That's fine, but as of right now, that's kind of the way it's going. And I know, of course, I just said "and" again, but I know that this is after I have the entire draft written. I've spent hours and hours and years of my life thinking about it, meditating on it, writing it, rewriting it. And this is how I have decided to start this one specific book. To anyone out there who's like, wow, that's good, Jason, that you started your book that way, but how do I start my book? Well, just so you know, this wasn't 2 years ago. This wasn't the start of the book. The ending of the book was actually the start of the book, and all of this was backstory. Yes, the entire thesis novel that I submitted for my master's of fine arts and creative writing was all backstory at the beginning. I wrote one chapter that ended up being the end of the book that I wanted to be the beginning. Correction, that ended up being the end of, they wanted to be the beginning. That's right. And it was missing something. I didn't quite know how to I knew there was more needed to be there, but I needed to change the voice and the style and things like that. So for my next writing submission, I didn't just delete it. I was like, well, let me just go and dive a little bit more into the backstory, move the beginning back a little bit, so whatever I'm writing, it'll still work. And then I can just move it forward and rewrite it. For example, if you are writing a story from third person, omniscient. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, right? And then, Peggy Sue walks down the road, meets the dashing knight, realizes he's a jerk, and kills him. Got it. But as soon as wow, I should probably show the whole thing from Peggy Sue's perspective. As soon as you rewrite that one part, now you're spinning your wheels. But so I chose, you can move forward and write in different voices, but as soon as I found the right voice and the right point of view, I wanted just to be able to go and rewrite everything that came after it and not need to move around and jump around and change the story. Because if you're writing a story in third person omniscient, which has had its day, by the way, it's very different than if you're writing like in a first person close. So yeah, first person close. That's awesome. So anyway, so I kept moving the start of the story back and back and back and back, changing point of views, changing perspectives, all of this, until eventually when I found the right mix of, having her with her journal and the right cognitive distance to use for the different third person characters and stuff like this, I had basically written an entire novel that was all backstory. So I went ahead and rewrote the whole thing to fit the way I had discovered how to write it. And that was my thesis novel, and that's the novel that I'm working on now, even though the entire next book was actually the book I wanted to write. That is how this story came around. So, if you're trying to figure out how to start your book, my advice to you, yes, some writers are like, well, I always start the book at the beginning. Okay, fine, go for it. If that works for you, cool. I always start the book at the end. Or I start the book at the end, start the book at the end. Got it. However you want to handle it. The punchline is write the darn stuff down. If you have a scene in your head, freaking work on writing it. This is what I do. Other people might have different things. Fine. Work on writing it. Writer's block. I don't really believe in writer's block. I really don't. And I know we're supposed to have, cool things to say here, but I really don't believe in writer's block. And the reason why is as soon as you're writing, let's say you're one of those people who write from beginning to end. Let's say you're one of the really high key people who always write the end so you know where the book's going, and then you go back to the beginning and start writing. Cool. Good for you. Glad it works out for you. I can't do it that way. As you're writing, you're like, man, I can't get the words on the page. They're just not coming. I don't know what to do. I don't know what's happening next. I have my outline here. I don't get it. I walked around the room. I'm still stuck on writer's block. Then freaking write something else. Write from the point of view of a cup. Write from the point of view of the person who's just outside the door. There's always something to write about. And people are like, well, I have writer's block because I don't know quite how to tell the next part. Okay, jump ahead 5 years and tell that part. Go back to the end of the story that you already have written and write the scene that comes before it. Go back and write some, a prologue, write an epilogue. There's always something you can put toward, even if you're writing, like, say, third person, James Bond kicks open the door and looks down his gun and here's what he thinks, and here's what he, not here's what he thinks, but here is what he thinks, and here's what, goes on the next second. Got it. Go ahead, shift perspective, and talk about the assassin who's sneaking up behind him from that person's perspective. Well, we're not going to go head hopping like that. But okay, I don't care. As soon as you have writer's block, or you don't know how to start the start of your story, just write something that is in that world. Write something that's in that universe, and I promise you, it will help. Even if you're like, well, I didn't know this bad guy thought this about his mama. Well, congratulations. Now you know the bad guy thinks that about their mama. You got an extra 3 pages out, or you wrote for an extra 20 minutes, or you wrote for an extra hour. You got what you wanted accomplished for your writing regimen. Good for you. Because I promise you, you will figure out where, I promise you this, as soon as you get a manuscript length book, as soon as you think, dude, my book is done, here's how cool I am, and you give it to someone and they read it and they're a good writer, or at least even if they're a good reader, first off, I have a hard time trusting readers who aren't writers, at least when it comes to editing your book. As soon as you give it to somebody you trust and they go to give you feedback, if you really truly believe their feedback, they're going to say something that's going to break your heart. And as soon as you are married to, no, this is the absolute beginning of my book, or this is the absolute end, or this has to be it, even if it survives that way until it is in the editor's hands or an agent's hands, they will come to you and they will say, listen, make this change, and I want the ending should be this, the beginning should be this. They will give you suggestions. So do not be afraid to write ahead of where you think the ending, but you don't be afraid to write before where you think the start should be or after where you think the end should be. Just get the book written, tell the story, and then once you have the entire story told, then cut and splice and move around. But when you're staring at a blank piece of paper is not, when you're staring at a blank piece of paper, that's not when to sit here and worry about where the end or where the start is. Don't. Just tell your darn story. Whatever that story is you have in your head that's really itching you. As soon as you think, you know what, I want to really, really, really write about a city mouse and a country mouse. Well, got it. Don't sit here and bang your head against the desk for 3 weeks wondering what point of view to, tell the story in. Or you can think about it, and you can give it some careful thought, but don't worry about it. Like, well, where do I start the story? Well, I don't know. Do you want to start with the city mouse or the country mouse? Well, I don't know. Okay, sit down at a blank piece of paper and pick one, flip a coin, and then what's that city mouse doing in that moment? Well, the city mouse is out on a patio somewhere looking over the city drinking coffee. Got it. Write that part of the story. And it'll get you, even that right there will get you in the mind of the city mouse or the country mouse, and it will get you started. So, well, at least I didn't say and, I said so. But back on topic, once you have your story written, then you will decide, it will be pretty evident where the start and where the end should be. And that is when you sit and you worry, okay, is there an inciting incident that gets people going? Oh, there isn't an inciting incident because all I did was write the first 30 pages of the story about how the city mouse is sitting there overlooking the city drinking tea and wondering things. Well, what makes a city mouse be off the couch and be sitting outside? A longing, a letter, the mouse got from a cousin who just died, and now the city mouse really is questioning life. Guess what? There's your inciting incident, and you didn't even think about it until the entire story was written, and you're sitting down, and you're like, crud, I don't have an inciting incident. Or when your manuscript's done, and then you look at it, and you're like, oh, the first 2 pages, the first 10 pages are completely boring with the city mouse just reading nothing in the newspaper. Okay, well, now we need to condense that. And instead of talking about what the city mouse read in the newspaper, now it's just one paragraph where the city mouse hits a couple highlights. And then the letter comes where the city mouse is, pulled off the couch because of some horrible tragedy. Well, I hope that helped. I hope now you feel more comfortable when you go to start a story. I know it's helped me to be able to explain all this. And if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to email me at jason@whereonpodcast.com, WHEREON podcast.com. And when I'm done with these next few pages of rewrite, I'm certain I'll have something else to talk about. Not certain what it's going to be quite yet. But if you have any suggestions or anything that you're interested in or would like some insight on, please feel free to email me or message me those as well. Take care.